Hi Ryan, it's Wednesday over here, and I just wanted to talk for a second about the crazy election that's going on. Isn't it crazy? No, but seriously, I got to thinking that this year, most of my students are of that age that this is the first presidential election that they'll ever be able to vote in, and I wanted to come up with something to tell them, and the overwhelming message that I came up with was, it's not always like this. I'm sorry, it's a weird one. It's not usually this crazy. But then I got to thinking, maybe it is this crazy sometimes, and I started thinking about previous election cycles, and I came up with an odd theory. Now, this is not like an official historian theory or anything like that. It's just something weird that I noticed. And what I think is going on is that about every 50 years, not exactly 50 years, but like approximately every 50 years, American politics just kind of goes a little bit nuts. So I want to spend the next couple of videos and kind of go back and look at some of these crazy elections. And that means going not exactly 50 years ago, but approximately 50 years ago, and looking at one of the craziest elections of all time, 1968. Now, to understand the 1968 election, you have to understand the lead up to 1968. First of all, it's the middle of the Vietnam War. The war is raging. It's been going on for a long time. And you should know that the Vietnam War was basically blamed on the Democratic Party. It was seen as the Democrats' war. John F. Kennedy had kind of started the Vietnam War, and then LBJ, who was president at the time, also of the Democratic Party, was responsible for expanding that war into what it became. And early in January of 68, things in Vietnam had gotten even crazier with the Tet Offensive. This was a massive attack that killed a lot of people. Even though it was kind of a military victory for the United States, it wasn't interpreted that way at the time, so people thought that they were losing the war, and there was all this controversy. There was a huge protest movement going on. There was all these hippies and other people that were against the war, and they were protesting it, and they were in the streets marching. Sometimes those marches didn't go well, and sometimes they turned out violent, and you had conservatives and hippies in the streets fighting with each other. And on top of all this unrest with the war, there was the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was doing his thing, and he was giving speeches, and he was fighting for legal change. The Selma marches had happened. Just a few years before had been the Freedom Summer, when civil rights activists in Mississippi had been murdered by people working with the Klan. That includes law enforcement officers and political officials of the area. The Black Power movement was starting to grow as people got increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress on civil rights. In April of that year, Martin Luther King got shot in the face. As a result of his assassination, riots broke out all over the country. There's race riots happening all over the place at the same time. Think of something way worse than Ferguson happening in multiple cities all at the same time across the country, and that's kind of what was happening that April. And it's in this climate that election season starts. Now, on the Republican side, you have Nixon. Now, when I say Nixon to you, you probably think scandal and Watergate, but back in 1968, he didn't have those associations yet. He was actually seen as the responsible one. He had been vice president under Eisenhower, and he kind of represented a more moderate version of the Republican Party. So let's go over to the Democratic side, where things were a little bit more dramatic. First, you have Eugene McCarthy. Remember, Johnson is the current president and the Democrat. Eugene McCarthy challenges him from the left. He comes at LBJ mostly with an anti-war platform. McCarthy's the one going out there, getting support from young people, mostly anti-war protesters, the youth, the hippie movement. He's anti-war. He's the get us out of Vietnam guy. Well, as that movement is heating up, you have Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, jumps in. He's also on the anti-war movement, but he focuses more on race issues. So he starts building this platform of social justice for African Americans, expanding civil rights, and he starts getting a following with a different segment of the youth vote as well. Now, LBJ has only served one term, and he's already got two challengers on his own party. So LBJ's response to this was shocking to everyone when he announced that he will not run for re-election. In fact, it was so shocking that his own aides that were on stage with him didn't know he was going to say this, and they're freaking out. So then another third Democrat steps up, the vice president of the time, Hubert Humphrey. A lot of the mainline Democrats end up going with Humphrey. He's seen as continuing LBJ's policy. He's the establishment candidate. The rumor was that LBJ's kind of behind him pulling the strings. I don't know if that's true, probably not. So basically the Democrats are split into these three factions. You've got McCarthy, the anti-war guy. You've got Bobby Kennedy, the anti-war plus the race issues. And then there's Humphrey, the establishment guy who's for continuing the war in Vietnam, but has big support from the unions, the labor unions, and from a lot of the big city political bosses. Now, before we get any further, I mentioned that Nixon didn't have any other Republican challengers, but he did have challengers from the right wing. There was a group of more extreme Republicans mixed with a group of more old school segregationist Democrats. These were some of these old school Democrats that had been against civil rights legislation, and they were frustrated that the Democratic Party had been shifting towards support for civil rights over the last several decades, and this was kind of their last hurrah. So it was this group that supported a third-party candidate running as an independent, a guy named George Wallace. He's the former governor of Alabama. He campaigns with a Confederate flag behind him. I'll give you one guess as to what his main campaign issue was. That's right, he's super big on segregation. He does not like civil rights. He wants the smallest government possible. He thinks the federal government's too big. In fact, the federal government should be so small that it should not be allowed to make civil rights legislation, and he wants to go back to a segregated society. He likes Jim Crow laws, wants to go back to those. He doesn't want black people voting. He doesn't want black people going to the same schools as his kids. He doesn't want black people going to the same restaurants as him or the same water fountains as him. You get the idea. And by the way, Wallace's running mate, his vice presidential candidate, is Curtis LeMay, the old Air Force general who's like the guy responsible for firebombing Japan and for dropping the atomic bombs on Japan as well. Spoiler alert, but George Wallace is going to end up taking all of the Deep South states: Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas. So he's doing his thing. Now back to the Democrats. Humphrey is the establishment guy, and he's got the clear lead for a while. And Kennedy and McCarthy are battling it out hard for that second place spot until, right after the California primary, Kennedy gets shot in the face. Bobby Kennedy is dead. A major candidate for president has just been assassinated, and his supporters, though, don't rally behind McCarthy like you might expect them to. You'd think that those two factions would have united and kind of combined their anti-war vote. Some of them did, some of them just kind of drifted away in frustration, but many rallied behind someone else, a newcomer, George McGovern. McGovern is a Kennedy supporter. He's also another anti-war candidate and a fan of civil rights. So instead of combining the McCarthy and Kennedy tickets, they split even more. All of this comes to a head at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. And not only are there heated debates happening inside the convention with politicians pushing each other around, but outside the convention, about 10,000 protesters gathered. Most of these are anti-war folks, a lot of them are hippies. The Chicago police just descend on these people and start beating the crap out of them. Protesters start fighting back. It's insane. Even reporters like Dan Rather and Mike Wallace are getting roughed up by the cops. But eventually, none of that mattered because Humphrey, the establishment guy, just dominated the vote. And then that didn't matter either because when it came to the general election, he got completely squashed by Nixon. So you can see things got pretty crazy in 1968. I don't think we are that crazy right now yet, but next time we're going to go 50 years before that and see what happened in 1912, one of my personal favorite election stories. All right, we'll come back to you then. See ya.